the air in Sony Music Studios in New York City was heavy with anticipation on the evening of November 18th, 1993. Fans, journalists, and a handful of invited industry insiders had gathered, their murmurs and shifting chairs punctuating the otherwise dim, contemplative space. Everyone expected Kurt Cobain to storm the stage with the fierce, unrelenting energy that had become synonymous with Nirvana's live shows. There were rumors, whispered anxieties, and quiet predictions that he might be late, might be distracted, might even falter. But no one could imagine what was about to unfold. As the stage lights glimmered and the minimal set design came into view. Scattered candles, a few autumnal flowers, and sparse furniture, a collective realization rippled through the room. This would not be a typical performance. It would be intimate, fragile, and haunting in a way that redefined the very concept of an MTV Unplugged concert. Kurt Cobain walked onto the stage wearing a gray cardigan over a faded t-shirt, his hair unkempt, his eyes carrying a distant, introspective weight. There was no swagger, no overt rock star, theatrics, only a cautious presence that drew the room into quiet attention. For those who had seen Cobain perform dozens of times, the contrast was striking. The frontman who had ripped through arenas with electric fury now moved with a deliberate slowness, as if every step, every chord, was measured and significant. As he sat down with his acoustic guitar, the audience held their breath. Even the camera operators, veterans of countless recordings, seemed caught in a reverent pause, their lenses capturing the subtleties of his posture and expression. The mood was already transformative, curiosity intertwined with apprehension. Here was a man whose public persona often teetered on aggression and volatility, now revealing vulnerability in its purest, most deliberate form. The set opened with About a Girl, a track from Nirvana's debut album, Bleach. The notes emerged quietly, measured and deliberate. Cobain's voice, fragile yet oddly commanding, carried through the small studio in a way that left no room for distraction. The audience leaned forward unconsciously, drawn into the immediacy of the moment. Every subtle variation in chord progression, every minor pause, every inhale before a lyric conveyed a profound intimacy. Critics who had expected a grunge onslaught found themselves caught off guard. Journalists who had rehearsed their notes and quotes realized they were witnessing not just a performance, but a study in emotional transparency. Cobain's voice seemed to occupy the entire room simultaneously, soft yet insistent, revealing the cracks, the tremors, the humanity that had often been overshadowed by his larger-than-life reputation. As the performance continued, the deliberate pacing became more apparent. Songs like Come As You Are and All Apologies were stripped of their electric bombast, leaving room for Cobain's delicate finger-picking to guide the audience through previously familiar landscapes in a radically new way. Where once a guitar solo would dominate, now silence carried weight. The pauses between phrases, the careful inflection of each syllable, and the subtle resonance of the acoustic strings created a tension that was almost unbearable in its intensity. Fans later recounted that they could hear the shifting of chairs, the faint intake of breath, the subtle hum of the studio itself, a reminder that they were witnesses to a unique, ephemeral communion between artist and audience. These were not mere songs being performed. They were experiences, meticulously constructed and profoundly affecting. Cobain's choice of covers further amplified the unexpected depth of the evening. David Bowie's The Man Who Sold the World was delivered with a trembling reverence that revealed layers of emotion seldom associated with Cobain's public image. His voice, at times quivering, conveyed not only musicality, but a palpable empathy with the song's narrative, bridging the distance between artist and listener in a way that felt almost sacred. The crowd remained hushed, some in tears, others in stunned silence. Every note was dissected subconsciously, every inflection absorbed. For the first time, the audience collectively understood that they were witnessing a performance that demanded attention, not through aggression or spectacle, but through emotional gravity. The contrast between what they had expected, a grunge explosion, and what was unfolding, a measured, poignant, and deeply intimate performance, created a profound tension that rippled through the studio like a silent, vibrating thread. The subtleties extended beyond Cobain's vocals and guitar. Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl, his bandmates, mirrored the restrained energy, providing a delicate scaffolding that accentuated Cobain's lead rather than overpowering it. Novoselic's upright bass added depth without dominating, and Grohl, seated behind a minimalist drum setup, maintained rhythm with precision and sensitivity. The interplay among the three musicians was almost telepathic, each movement intentional, each note a conscious decision in service of the performance's intimacy. No flashy solos, no aggressive crescendos, just musicians fully attuned to the emotional contour of each song. Fans later described the experience as sitting inside the brain of Kurt Cobain, a metaphor that underscored how transformative and immersive the performance truly was. Throughout the set, Cobain's physical demeanor communicated as much as the music itself. He occasionally glanced down, adjusting his fingers or catching the subtle cues of his bandmates, yet there was a constant undercurrent of tension, fragile, almost imperceptible. Every shift in posture, every tilt of the head, every pause before a lyric contributed to an intricate emotional architecture for those present. The performance was less about spectacle and more about vulnerability. The public image of Cobain as a volatile, rebellious icon was replaced momentarily by a human figure grappling with his own fragility, yet projecting it outward with remarkable clarity. The audience's empathy was not optional. It was demanded. The atmosphere remained charged as the performance unfolded, each song revealing yet another layer of Cobain's artistry and personal expression. After the haunting delivery of "The Man Who Sold the World," there was a collective intake of breath in the studio. Cobain's ability to take a familiar track and reshape it into a deeply emotional experience underscored his mastery over nuance and timing. The room was silent, but for the subtle resonance of the guitar strings, the faint shuffle of Novoselic's bass, and the soft percussion from Grohl. It was a performance that demanded attention not by volume or spectacle, but by intensity of presence, a presence that made the audience hyper-aware of every gesture, every inflection, every micro-expression. Cobain moved on to Pennyroyal, T, a song from Nirvana's then unreleased album In Utero. His voice carried the song's inherent melancholy, yet there was an added layer of vulnerability, amplified by the intimate setting. Unlike arena shows where the energy of the crowd can mask subtle vocal nuances, the MTV Unplugged environment allowed every quiver, every slight falter to become magnified. Journalists later noted that Cobain's control over dynamics, how he whispered certain lines and allowed others to swell with emotion, created a palpable tension in the room. Fans who had listened to the studio recordings described feeling as though they were hearing the song for the very first time, encountering emotional depths previously obscured by distortion and amplification. The decision to incorporate lesser-known tracks and cover songs throughout the set reflected Cobain's meticulous curatorial approach. Beyond Bowie's iconic number, he chose Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Traditional folk song he had adapted and made intensely personal. Cobain's interpretation was raw, yet precise, and his vocal delivery carried a fragility that contrasted sharply with his usual punk-influenced aggression. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell into a respectful silence. Some attendees later recounted that the quiet was so complete that one could hear the subtle intake of breath or the gentle rustling of the camera operators as they adjusted their equipment. This level of attentiveness spoke not only to the intimacy of the performance, but to the rare emotional connection Cobain fostered between himself and his audience. Cobain's stage presence throughout the show was a study in contrasts. On one hand, he appeared physically fragile, occasionally hunched over his guitar, eyes downcast, seemingly withdrawn. On the other, his artistry radiated a quiet, undeniable power. Each gesture, from the gentle tap of his foot to keep rhythm to the subtle nods, acknowledging his bandmates' cues, was measured, deliberate, and imbued with meaning. Observers often noted that it was this duality, vulnerability, and authority that made the Unplugged performance so compelling. Unlike typical rock concerts, where grandiosity and physicality dominate, Cobain's presence demanded a form of active listening, a willingness to engage emotionally and intellectually. The song choices themselves highlighted Cobain's breadth as a musician and interpreter. With About a Girl, he revisited Nirvana's early work, stripping it down to its melodic core. With Dumb, he conveyed an understated pathos that resonated more deeply in the Unplugged format than in previous studio or live renditions. His ability to vary vocal timbre and phrasing, to introduce subtle pauses and emphasize certain words, created layers of meaning that could only be appreciated in this intimate setting. Music critics at the time remarked that Cobain's interpretations were not just performances, they were emotional dialogues with the audience, demanding reflection and empathy. Throughout the performance, Cobain's interactions with his bandmates added another dimension to the experience. Chris Novoselic's bass lines provided subtle harmonic grounding, supporting Cobain's melodic explorations without overshadowing them. Dave Grohl's percussion was understated yet crucial, offering texture and rhythmic stability while allowing Cobain's voice and guitar to remain central. The trio's interplay was almost telepathic, each musician responding instinctively to the other's dynamics, anticipating changes in tempo and mood, and maintaining an organic cohesion that elevated the performance. Beyond a simple acoustic set, for those present, it became clear that this was not only a performance but a demonstration of profound musical empathy. Cobain's personal struggles, widely reported in the media, added an undercurrent of tension to the evening. Observers were aware of his chronic health issues, documented battles with depression, and the pressure of public scrutiny. While these factors might have threatened to overshadow the performance, Cobain transformed them into artistic potency. The quiet, deliberate pacing of the set, the intentional focus on vulnerability, and the inclusion of deeply personal song choices allowed him to channel his experiences into something universally relatable. In this sense, the Unplugged session became both a private catharsis and a public offering, bridging the gap between personal anguish and collective experience. As the performance moved forward, the audience's emotional investment intensified. When Cobain transitioned into Something in the Way, the atmosphere grew almost tangible, heavy with anticipation and empathetic resonance. The song's sparse instrumentation, primarily Cobain's voice and guitar, allowed listeners to fully inhabit the narrative of despair and isolation conveyed by the lyrics. For many, this was the defining moment of the evening, a point where the audience and performer existed within the same emotional space. The boundary between stage and spectator temporarily dissolved. The silence that enveloped the studio was not passive. It was active engagement, a form of communal introspection rarely achieved in contemporary rock performances. Cobain's careful attention to detail extended beyond music to the visual and atmospheric elements of the set. The candles placed strategically around the stage cast soft, flickering light, emphasizing the contours of his face and the worn texture of his clothing. The flowers, chosen for their subdued colors and simplicity, added a layer of contemplative serenity. Every element of the environment, from seating arrangements to lighting angles, was orchestrated to complement the performance's intimate tone. Observers noted that these choices were not mere aesthetic decisions. They reinforced the narrative of vulnerability, reflection, and emotional authenticity that permeated the evening. By the midpoint of the set, it became evident that Cobain's performance was redefining audience expectations. Fans and critics alike were confronted with the realization that the familiar persona of the aggressive, irreverent grunge icon was not absent but transformed. What had once been raw and chaotic was now distilled into precision and subtlety, each musical and emotional gesture deliberate and meaningful. The tension between expectation and reality created a continuous thread of curiosity, as listeners tried to reconcile their prior knowledge of Cobain with the nuanced, intimate presentation before them. This dynamic engagement exemplified the core of the Unplugged experience, not mere performance, but a shared journey into the emotional and artistic depths of one of rock music's most iconic figures. As the MTV Unplugged session progressed into its middle phase, a quiet intensity settled over the room, almost tangible in its weight. Cobain's physical presence seemed smaller yet somehow more commanding, each motion purposeful, each breath deliberate. When he began, "Jesus doesn't want me for a sunbeam," the audience was met with a performance stripped to its emotional core. The song, a cover from the Vaselines, had an inherent simplicity in its chord structure, but under Cobain's interpretation, it became a vessel for deep introspection. His voice carried a combination of melancholy, fragility, and quiet resilience, highlighting nuances of the lyrics that were often overlooked in the original. Fans who had prepared to see a grunge powerhouse instead found themselves drawn into an intimate narrative, each word weighted with meaning. The choice of song order throughout the set was deliberate, creating an ebb and flow of tension and release. After the tender delivery of "Jesus doesn't want me for a sunbeam," Cobain shifted into "The Man Who Sold the World," a cover that had quickly become one of the evening's most iconic moments. Unlike Bowie's polished studio version, Cobain's performance was haunting and raw, marked by subtle vocal tremors that conveyed both reverence and a personal connection to the material. The audience's silence was almost reverential. Even the smallest noise, the soft click of a camera, the faint creak of a chair, seemed to echo unnaturally in the hushed studio. Journalists present later remarked that the tension was nearly unbearable, a testament to Cobain's ability to draw listeners fully into the emotional landscape he was crafting in real time. Cobain's personal struggles were known to most attendees, even if only superficially, and these struggles lent the performance an undercurrent of gravity. Chronic health issues, persistent bouts of depression, and the relentless pressures of fame were never far from the surface. Yet rather than allow these factors to undermine his performance, Cobain harnessed them, channeling vulnerability into profound, artistic expression. The subtle tremors in his voice, the occasional faltering note, and the hesitant, deliberate strumming patterns all contributed to a performance that was both emotionally authentic and technically impressive. It became clear that every choice, every nuance was intentional, reinforcing a narrative of resilience interwoven with fragility. The audience's reaction evolved as the set progressed. Initial curiosity and anticipation transformed into a palpable, collective empathy. Each song elicited a unique response, from quiet smiles to teary eyes, from subtle nods to whispered exclamations. Cobain's dynamic range, shifting effortlessly from hushed intimacy to moments of stark intensity, kept the audience perpetually engaged. Even songs from Nirvana's own catalog, such as "Polly and About a Girl," were reinterpreted in ways that heightened emotional impact. The absence of electric instruments and distortion allowed the lyrics to shine in their raw form, forcing listeners to confront the narratives embedded within. For many, this was a revelation, a deeper understanding of Cobain as both a musician and a human being, stripped of the layers of fame and public persona. The interplay with his bandmates continued to enhance the performance's depth. Chris Novoselic's upright bass provided a grounding resonance, supporting Cobain's melodic explorations without overwhelming them. Dave Grohl, confined to a minimalist drum setup, delivered subtle, percussive textures that enriched the arrangements while maintaining space for emotional resonance. The trio's cohesion was remarkable. Every glance, every slight adjustment, every nuanced shift in timing demonstrated an almost telepathic communication. This synchronicity allowed Cobain to explore emotional subtleties with confidence, knowing that his bandmates would respond intuitively, reinforcing the delicate architecture of the performance. Cobain's visual expression complemented the music. Candles flickered across the stage, casting moving shadows that highlighted the contours of his face, his hands, and the worn texture of his cardigan. The sparse floral arrangements added a layer of contemplative elegance, enhancing the sense of intimacy. Observers noted that every detail, lighting, arrangement, spacing, was crafted to draw attention inward, toward the music and emotion, rather than outward toward spectacle. Cobain's use of minimalism extended beyond instrumentation. It permeated the entire environment, creating a space where vulnerability could breathe and listeners could engage fully. By mid-set, the audience had begun to recognize the profound contrast between expectation and reality. Cobain's public image, often characterized by raw aggression, irreverence, and unpredictable behavior, was still present, but it had been filtered through a lens of introspection, subtlety, and vulnerability. This duality generated a continuous curiosity gap. Fans were left questioning, interpreting, and reflecting. How could someone so associated with chaos evoke such control? How could aggression coexist with fragility? These questions lingered, unspoken yet omnipresent, amplifying the emotional resonance of each note and lyric. Cobain's rendition of All Apologies marked a particularly poignant moment. The familiar melody, stripped to acoustic simplicity, became a meditation on accountability, regret, and human imperfection. His phrasing emphasized particular words, drawing listeners' attention to subtleties that might have been lost in louder, more frenetic performances. Each pause and inflection seemed calculated to maximize emotional weight, demonstrating Cobain's mastery of pacing, timing, and audience engagement. It was a masterclass in subtlety, a performance that demanded attention not through spectacle, but through the quiet, deliberate conveyance of complex emotion. Even the brief exchanges between Cobain and his audience carried significance. Occasional murmurs, small smiles, or nods became integral to the shared experience, reinforcing the intimacy of the session. It was clear that the performer and listeners were engaged in a silent dialogue. Every song, every pause, every glance was a line in a conversation that transcended words. Fans later reflected on the sense of shared presence, describing the experience as if they had been allowed a glimpse into the private emotional landscape of Kurt Cobain, a rare and fleeting insight into the mind of a rock icon. As the set approached its latter half, the anticipation for Where Did You Sleep Last Night began to build. The traditional folk song, reinterpreted through Cobain's voice and lens, would later be regarded as the emotional apex of the performance. Even before a single note was played, the audience sensed its weight. The tension, both musical and psychological, had been carefully cultivated through the first half of the session, and now it converged on a single, unforgettable moment. The anticipation was not manufactured. It was earned through meticulous pacing, emotional investment, and Cobain's ability to inhabit each song fully and authentically. As the MTV Unplugged performance entered its critical final phase, the studio atmosphere was charged with a quiet, almost sacred intensity. Kurt Cobain's presence on stage had transformed the audience's expectations entirely. What had begun as curiosity and mild anticipation had evolved into a profound, shared emotional experience. Every chord, Every subtle breath, every tremor in his voice resonated with the listeners, demanding their full attention. The audience was no longer passive. They were participants in an unfolding narrative, witnesses to a performance that would soon be remembered as historic. Cobain's rendition of "Something in the Way" drew the audience into an almost unbearable intimacy. The song, with its minimalist arrangement, relied entirely on the weight of Cobain's voice and the sparse, acoustic guitar. In contrast to the explosive energy often associated with Nirvana, this performance emphasized stillness and emotional gravity. Each line was drawn out, each pause pregnant with meaning. Those in the studio later recounted feeling a sense of suspended time, as though every observer was being held captive by the quiet intensity of the moment. The simplicity of the arrangement magnified the emotional impact, and listeners found themselves confronting the raw vulnerability Cobain projected so effortlessly throughout the evening. Cobain's choice to include lesser-known tracks and covers contributed to a layered, unpredictable experience. The Vaseline's "Jesus Doesn't Want Me" for a Sunbeam and Lead Belly's "Where Did You Sleep Last Night" were not merely songs. They were vehicles through which Cobain conveyed a depth of feeling that few performers could achieve. His interpretation of "Where Did You Sleep Last Night" in particular became legendary for its haunting, almost ritualistic intensity. As Cobain's voice rose and fell with tremulous power, the audience experienced a range of emotions from awe to melancholy. The song's crescendos and subtle inflections showcased Cobain's capacity to manipulate tension and release, guiding listeners through a visceral emotional journey. The collaboration with Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl remained a key component of the performance's power. Novoselic's upright bass provided a steady harmonic anchor, its resonance supporting Cobain's vocal flourishes without overwhelming them. Grohl's percussion, minimal yet deliberate, created textures that punctuated the songs with subtle dynamism. The three musicians' interplay was telepathic. Small visual cues, slight nods, and unconscious gestures ensured that each transition, each pause, was executed with precise emotional timing. Observers later noted that the trio's cohesion elevated the performance beyond technical proficiency. It became a living, breathing conversation between musicians and audience. Cobain's emotional authenticity was complemented by meticulous attention to visual details. The dim candlelight flickered across the stage, casting shadows that emphasized the contours of his face and the worn texture of his clothing. Flowers, strategically placed around the set, added an understated elegance, their muted tones reflecting the contemplative mood of the evening. These environmental choices were not aesthetic alone. They reinforced the narrative of vulnerability and introspection, ensuring that every visual element served the emotional arc of the performance. Fans later described the stage as a sacred space, a temporary sanctuary where Cobain's fragility could be shared and understood. As the performance continued, the tension between expectation and reality remained palpable. Those who had anticipated an energetic, grunge set were forced to reconcile their preconceived notions with the intimate, deliberate presentation unfolding before them. Cobain's public persona, volatile, rebellious, unpredictable, was still present, yet reframed through a lens of subtlety and introspection. This contrast heightened the emotional stakes, compelling listeners to engage both cognitively and emotionally. The curiosity gap was maintained. Audience members found themselves continually questioning, interpreting, and reflecting on what they were witnessing, deepening their investment in the performance. Cobain's interactions with the audience, though minimal, were charged with significance. Small gestures, slight eye contact, and moments of understated acknowledgement created a sense of shared experience. Observers later remarked that these subtle exchanges fostered a powerful sense of connection, reinforcing the intimacy and authenticity of the session. For many, it was as if they had been allowed a fleeting glimpse into the private, emotional world of Kurt Cobain, a rare opportunity to witness the true complexity of his artistry and humanity. When Cobain began All Apologies, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The song, delivered with acoustic simplicity, conveyed a profound mixture of regret, reflection, and resignation. His phrasing, the careful placement of pauses, and the nuanced emphasis on certain words created a layered narrative that extended beyond the lyrics themselves. Listeners were drawn into a reflective state, absorbing the subtle interplay of melody, emotion, and intention. The performance became a shared meditation on imperfection, vulnerability, and the human condition, leaving a lasting impression on all present. The final moments of the set were marked by a crescendo of emotional intensity. As Cobain moved into the climactic moments of "Where Did You Sleep Last Night?", his voice oscillated between fragile whispers and powerful, almost guttural wails. The tension that had been carefully cultivated throughout the evening reached its zenith, enveloping the audience in an almost tangible wave of empathy and awe. Every nuance, every inflection, every pause, every tremor was magnified in the quiet studio, leaving a lasting imprint on the listeners. For those who witnessed it firsthand, the performance transcended music. It became an unforgettable encounter with the depth of human emotion as conveyed through Kurt Cobain's artistry. The final phase of Kurt Cobain's MTV Unplugged performance carried a weight that few in the studio had anticipated. By now the audience was fully absorbed, every note, pause, and breath magnified in the hushed, intimate setting. The evening had evolved from an acoustic performance into a shared emotional journey, one that exposed the fragility, artistry, and humanity of a musician whose public persona was often defined by chaos and rebellion. Cobain's physical presence, hunched over his guitar and occasionally glancing toward his bandmates, radiated an intensity that transcended the small studio space, filling every corner with the gravity of his expression. As he launched into the final rendition of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, the atmosphere became almost ritualistic. Cobain's voice oscillated between soft, trembling whispers and raw, guttural cries that carried the weight of personal experience and profound empathy. The acoustic guitar, his sole instrument, served as both foundation and conduit, amplifying the emotional resonance of every phrase. Fans and journalists alike later described feeling as though the boundaries between performer and listener had dissolved entirely. The room was suspended in an intense shared presence. It was the culmination of the meticulous pacing, nuanced delivery, and carefully constructed emotional architecture that had defined the evening. From the first note of About a Girl, Cobain's connection to the song extended beyond performance technique. The haunting narrative of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, with its themes of loss, despair, and haunting familial echoes, seemed to mirror elements of his personal struggles. Though he never explicitly framed the song as autobiographical, the vulnerability in his delivery suggested a profound identification with its emotional core. Each tremor in his voice, each subtle pause, and every crescendo conveyed a narrative of inner turmoil, resilience, and the human capacity for empathy. The audience's rapt attention reflected a recognition of the significance of these moments. Silence became an active participant, a co-creator of the performance's emotional impact. The band's support remained impeccable throughout. Chris Novoselic's upright bass lines provided a grounding resonance, subtle yet critical, allowing Cobain's melodic and emotional nuances to remain at the forefront. Dave Grohl's percussion, restrained and deliberate, punctuated each song with careful attention to timing and dynamic control. The trio's synergy was evident in every phrase, demonstrating not just technical skill but an emotional cohesion that amplified the intimacy of the performance. Observers noted that the musicians' interactions whether a fleeting glance or a subtle nod, created an almost telepathic understanding, facilitating a seamless navigation through the emotional landscape of the set. Cobain's subtle stage gestures contributed further to the performance's depth. Occasionally he would glance toward the audience, making brief eye contact that conveyed acknowledgement without breaking the performance's immersive spell. The candles flickered, casting moving shadows across his face and hands, emphasizing the worn texture of his clothing and the delicate motions of his strumming. The sparse floral arrangements added a layer of contemplative serenity, reinforcing the meditative quality of the session. Each visual element worked in harmony with the music, enhancing the narrative of vulnerability, introspection, and emotional authenticity that defined the evening. As the final chords of "Where Did You Sleep Last Night" resonated through the studio, a heavy, almost sacred silence followed. There were no immediate eruptions of applause. Instead, the room seemed to collectively exhale, as though absorbing the weight of what had transpired. Cobain, slumped over his guitar, appeared momentarily exhausted, yet the intensity in his eyes suggested a sense of fulfillment. Recognition that he had communicated something deeply personal, profoundly human, and universally resonant. For those present, the performance was not merely a concert. It was an intimate, transformative encounter, one that would be remembered as a defining moment in both Cobain's career and the history of live acoustic performance. The broader impact of the MTV Unplugged session extended far beyond the studio. Critics, fans, and historians have consistently highlighted this performance as a turning point in understanding Kurt Cobain's artistry. It revealed a side of him often obscured by media portrayals of rebellion, volatility, and despair. Here was a musician capable of commanding attention not through aggression or spectacle, but through subtlety, vulnerability, and emotional precision. The session has since become a benchmark for acoustic performances in rock history, studied for its pacing, emotional resonance, and ability to engage audiences on a deeply personal level. In the years following the performance, the recordings of the MTV Unplugged session continued to resonate with listeners. Cobain's nuanced interpretations, choice of covers, and the raw emotionality captured in the intimate setting have ensured the session's enduring legacy. Songs like All Apologies and Where Did You Sleep Last Night have become emblematic of his capacity to translate personal struggle into universally felt art. The performance demonstrated that Cobain's genius extended far beyond the stereotypical grunge iconography, revealing an artist attuned to emotional truth, capable of transforming simplicity into profound impact. Even the smallest details contributed to the session's timelessness. The spacing of musicians, the subtle shifts in lighting, the measured pauses between lines, all of these elements reinforced the performance's narrative and emotional architecture. Fans who attended the recording later recounted that the experience was immersive, almost cinematic in its depth, allowing them to feel as if they were living inside Cobain's creative mind. This ability to convey a full emotional arc in an intimate setting highlighted not only his technical skill, but also his extraordinary sensitivity as an interpreter of music and human emotion. By the time the final notes faded and the cameras stopped rolling, it was clear that the MTV Unplugged session had redefined expectations of both Kurt Cobain and live acoustic performance. The performance had achieved what few artists accomplish, transforming an intimate, subdued setting into a vehicle for historical, emotional, and artistic significance. Every nuance, from subtle tremors in the voice to deliberate pauses, from the interplay of musicians to the orchestrated stage environment, contributed to an enduring legacy that continues to captivate audiences and influence generations of musicians and fans alike. Cobain's MTV Unplugged session remains a testament to his mastery over subtlety, vulnerability, and emotional expression. It is remembered not only for the technical precision of the performances, but for the profound human connection it established between artist and audience. The session has since been immortalized through recordings, documentaries, and countless analyses, serving as both a pinnacle of Cobain's artistic output and a defining moment in the history of rock music. Here, Kurt Cobain revealed himself not as a mythic figure of chaos, but as a profoundly human artist whose emotional honesty and musical intuition continue to resonate decades later.